somebody were to say to me, let's just get rid of women's education, let's get rid of places like Barnard, I would actually have some pushback on that, right? Like, I think there's some really significant reasons why we still see gender oppression as a central problem in higher ed. Like, no doubt, right? Like, there's still intense marginalization of women from many disciplines, especially science and math and economics and other ones that are traditionally really held in, by men. There's a broad scale problem of, classroom marginalization of women in K through 12 and into higher ed. We still see that women are underrepresented in a lot of aspects of academia. Women are paid less in academia, especially women of color are less likely to have tenure track for positions in academia. We see all this marginalization, and more broadly that, like, secretary is still the #1 job for women. The lowest paid roles inside any industry are still more likely to be for women, especially women of color, and the higher paid roles are more likely to be for men, especially white men, right? Like, that's still the deal. There's still the pay gap. That stuff is still with us, and so that makes sense that we would still want to produce spaces of higher ed where we could pay specific attention to those problems and perhaps try to send resources in directions that are where they're not generally sent. Not to mention that colleges and universities are still intense spaces of sexual assault, right? Everywhere, I go speak colleges a lot, everywhere that is a central issue. Sexual violence against women is endemic in our society, and universities and colleges are a really intense place where that happens. So that's another reason we might think that women's education has a particular role, or that we might want to have a higher ed community in which we're specifically talking about gender oppression, and that might be preparing people who are there with a certain set of skills that are actually hard to get because of the kinds of oppression people face in higher ed. So women's education isn't the only way to do that, right? It's only one strategy, but I think it's one that actually still has a really meaningful place. And I feel like it's important to say because, of course, that's up for debate. Like, some people think that that's not the case, right? But the problem right now with women's education in the US, or one problem I'm here to talk about, is that it doesn't admit trans women, right? Like, it is transphobic, right? Like, that's really deep, right? The fundamental message of transphobia is that trans people are not who we say we are, that we're who the government says we are, or who a doctor says we are, or we're who any random person who wants to beat us up on the street says we are. Like, that's the message of transphobia is, we don't believe you, you don't exist, you're not who you say we are. Right now, women's colleges in the United States are saying that to trans people. And that matters, that's on blast. It really matters when a big institution that is using a definition of woman that is fundamentally transphobic. And it's like a set of institutions that are tied together doing this practice right now. And that is an urgent problem, regardless of whether or not you think Barnard's like the coolest strategy in the world for feminism, or it's disappointing to you, or whatever. This is a big problem for all of us. And if we're connected to this institution, we have an obligation to remedy it, I think.